This is something that happened to me and I still have no concrete explanation for it. I lived in Japan for 2 years, way out on the island of Kyushu in a really rural town. I was teaching English there and I lived in an apartment complex with 9 other English teachers and a handful of Japanese families. All of our apartments were 2-story, townhouse style. My apartment was the newest out of the bunch. Before me there had been another English teacher who lived there for 2 years, but before her, as far as I had been told, the apartment had been empty. I first moved in at the beginning of August, which is brutally hot and humid in Japan. It's so humid that the wallpaper in your apartment gets wet and starts to curl up. The only air conditioning in the apartment was downstairs and the bedrooms were upstairs. It was truly unpleasant and I ended up having to sleep downstairs to avoid the sweltering heat in my bedroom. That is how everything started. One day I came home from school to find my back door wide open. It was a sliding glass door, and before I left for school I had securely bolted it. I had locked the front door as well. At first I thought maybe someone had broken in, but nothing had been taken and not a single thing was out of place. One of my neighbors came over and looked everywhere with me, but we found nothing strange. At the time I thought it was no big deal. Probably just some curious Japanese kid who thought it would be fun to break in and look at what a foreigner's house was like. That night I was downstairs and I just lay down on my futon to go to sleep. All of a sudden I heard footsteps upstairs. At first it sounded like someone pacing back and forth between the 2 bedrooms. Then, suddenly, they stopped. At this point I was laying on my futon, shaking and holding my breath. I was terrified that whoever broke in earlier had managed to hide upstairs in the crawl space. After about a minute of silence I heard an incredibly loud bang, as though something huge and heavy had just fallen and hit the floor above me. I ran right out of my apartment and went to my neighbor's house. I convinced my neighbor to come back with me, and we searched upstairs, but we found nothing. This continued to happen every night, like clockwork. One night I was at the local bar with one of the other English teachers. He had been living there for 5 years. I started telling him about the strange things that kept happening every night and how I hadn't been able to sleep because of it. "Well, there's a reason for that," he said. "Before you, there was another teacher in that apartment, but before her, the apartment was empty. Nobody would live there because a woman hung herself upstairs after her husband left her. Japanese people wouldn't rent it because they thought the place was cursed. So it was empty until the Board of Education decided to rent it out to foreign teachers. At the time, I thought he was just making up things to try and scare me, but one day I asked my boss about it. He immediately turned white and said that the other teachers shouldn't be telling me things like that. I tried to press him for more information, but he would neither confirm or deny it. One day, while cleaning my apartment, I noticed something on the underside of the windowsill. Someone had carved the words, "Try to smile," in Japanese about 10 times. When I saw that, I think my blood literally ran cold. I still don't know what actually happened in that apartment, but every night during the summer, until I would start sleeping upstairs again, those noises would happen without fail. There was a 3-year-old boy who lived in a village in the Golan Heights in Israel, near the border with Syria. The boy was born with a red birthmark on his forehead. As soon as he was old enough to talk, he told his family that he had lived before. He pointed to the birthmark and said that he'd been murdered with an axe. The boy's parents took him to the village where he claimed he had lived. There they met with the village elders. The boy said he remembered his old name. It was the name of a man who had gone missing from the village 4 years before. He also showed them the house where he had lived. The boy said he remembered the name of the man who killed him. When the boy saw the man, he walked right up to him and said, "I used to be your neighbor. We had a fight, and you killed me with an axe." The man's face turned white as a sheet. Then the boy told the village elders, "I even know where he buried my body." They followed the boy to a nearby field, and he stopped in front of a pile of stones. When they removed the stones, they found a skeleton underneath. There was a wound in the skull, in exactly the same place where the boy's red birthmark was. The boy showed them where the axe was buried as well. At that point, the man broke down and confessed to the murder. There is a small village on the island of Hawaii called Ula'a. Nobody would ever guess the terrible secret this village holds. Following the accidental drowning of a young boy many years ago, today the tragedy still haunts the villagers and their children. Back in 1947, a group of kids were playing on the banks of a deep pond. They were outside the village. One boy accidentally tripped over a log and fell into the water with a splash. Before any of the other children could react, the boy sank beneath the water's shimmering surface. For a few moments they waited for him to resurface, but there was no sign of him. Horrified, they ran back to the village to get help. Some local men came as fast as they could and dived into the pond, searching all around for the young boy. They were terrified by what they found. The boy was sitting on a rock at the very bottom of the pond. His arms were hanging down by his sides and his body was swaying back and forth with the currents. His eyes were wide and his mouth was hanging open, but he was dead in the water. The eerie sight sent shivers down the spines of the men who had dived in to save him. They were deeply disturbed and said it was such an unusual way to drown. It was as if the boy had calmly sat down on the rock and waited there to die. They retrieved the corpse and dragged it onto the bank of the pond. Everyone who lived in the village was saddened by the tragedy, but after the funeral, they all tried to put the strange death behind them. Afterwards, bizarre rumors began to spread around the area. In the middle of the night, villagers would hear unexplained screams and cries coming from the direction of the pond. At first, they tried to tell themselves that the haunting cries were just caused by the wind blowing through the tall trees. However, as time went on, some people started to report disturbing experiences. Whenever people walked past the pond at night, they would feel something reaching out and trying to grab their feet. Many villagers believed that the ghost of the drowned boy lurked beneath the dark waters of the pond. They said that, at night, he would come to the surface, cold, wet, and shivering, his icy hands clutching at an unsuspecting victim and trying to pull them into his watery grave. According to the rumors, he was trapped in the world by accident, and the only way he could escape was to find someone else to take his place at the bottom of the pond. One day, a boy was out walking with his father. When they passed by the haunted pond, the boy picked up some stones and skimmed them across the surface of the water. Suddenly, the boy screamed out in terror. Something was holding his leg and dragging him into the pond. The boy clawed at the earth, trying to hold on, but it was no use. Before his father had a chance to grab hold of him, the boy was pulled down into the watery depths. The desperate father jumped into the pond and tried to find his son, but there was no trace of him. Minutes later, he dived deeper and finally located the young boy. He was sitting on a rock, on the bottom of the pond, arms placidly at his side, eyes and mouth wide open, swaying gently to and fro in the current. The father grasped his son, pulled him up to the surface. He made his way to the edge of the pond, dragging his son behind him like dead weight. Luckily, the father had taken some courses in first aid, and there, on the bank, he was able to perform mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on his son. The man did everything he could, and finally, just when he was about to give up, he saw his son's chest rise and fall, and the boy coughed up all the water in his lungs. The boy was alive. After that, all the parents in the village warned their children to stay away from the pond. A priest was brought in to bless the waters, and the local people felt that it would put an end to the haunting. However, on particularly dark nights, when the evening skies were black as ink, those who lived closest to the pond claimed that they could still hear the boy's terrifying screams. Some say that he will never find peace. Nowadays, nobody dares venture close to the pond, and every child in the village knows the story of the drowned boy. No one knows when the ghost will once again grow restless and try to claim another young life. Years ago, my uncle owned a funeral home and I got a summer job, working part-time in the crematorium. It wasn't a lot of fun, but it certainly paid well. And being a poor student, I definitely needed the money. Dealing with dead bodies was very creepy at first, but after a few days, you kind of get used to it. Kind of. One morning I was sweeping the floor in the crematorium when a black hearse pulled up in the parking lot outside. A man in a black suit stepped out, and my uncle went over to talk to him. After a while, he called me over and told me to help him carry the coffin into the crematorium. I thought this was strange, because usually they brought the coffins into the funeral home next door first. But I didn't ask any questions. We set the coffin down on the ground, and my uncle went over to prepare the oven for cremation. For a few minutes I was left alone with the man in the black suit. There was an awkward silence. I didn't know what to say. I assumed it was his relative who had just died and was laying in the coffin, but he didn't seem all that upset. When the oven was ready, my uncle and I picked up the coffin and brought it over to a metal bench. We took off the top of the casket. I saw that the corpse inside was a man who looked to be about 30 years old. Usually the dead bodies were very pale, but this one looked pink in the face. My uncle stoked the fire, then pressed a button to start the conveyor belt. The coffin was moved slowly into the oven. When it was all the way inside, my uncle closed the door and I just stood around waiting. It usually took an hour before everything was burnt and reduced to ashes. After that, I would have to collect the ashes and put them into an urn so they could be given to the family. My uncle and the man in the black suit went into the funeral home next door. I assumed they were filling out all the usual paperwork. I was left alone in the crematorium to continue sweeping. After about 10 minutes, I heard a strange noise coming from the oven. It was like a faint knocking sound at first. I thought it was just my imagination, but then it grew into a loud banging. I tried to tell myself it was just the metal warping from the heat. Bang, bang, bang. It was the unmistakable sound of someone frantically banging on something, desperately trying to get out. A chill went down my spine, and the broom fell from my hands. I was sure the man inside was still alive. Terrified, I ran into the funeral home, and shaking uncontrollably, I told my uncle what I had heard. Leading them back into the crematorium, I told them to listen. Bang! 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 I don't hear anything, said my uncle. Bang! 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 Me neither, said the man in the black suit. I looked at them, shocked and stunned. I even began to doubt my own sanity. My uncle and the man in the black suit shrugged their shoulders and went back to the funeral home. I just stood in the middle of the crematorium, listening intently. I don't know how to open the oven door safely, and, even if I did, I was terrified by what I might find inside. After 10 or 15 minutes in the furnace, could someone still be alive? Gradually the banging noise became weaker and weaker until it finally faded away altogether. All I could hear was the hiss and crackle of the flames. There was no more noise. An hour later my uncle came back to turn off the oven. Together we collected the ashes from the tray underneath and poured them into an urn. The man took it, and with a broad smile on his face, he got back into his car and drove away. At closing time, my uncle gave me an envelope full of money and told me not to mention what I had heard to anyone. We never spoke about it again, and business went on as usual. Even today, I still have nightmares about that hideous banging sound I heard coming from inside the oven.